My name is Yi-Chan Chong. I'm the Executive Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Spratt College, and I am very, very excited about today's event, Louis Riel and the Métis people. And this is in honor of Louis Riel Day on February 17th, and we are so lucky to have Amber Cordick here today to be presenting on this topic. Amber is an administrative assistant at the Victoria campus of Spratt, and she has a BA in environmental studies and politics, which she just was talking about from York University. And Amber has always had a passion for social justice and civil rights, focusing particularly on Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and land restitution. She also has a minor in anthropology, and that really spurred her interest in history, particularly of colonial Canada. After studying and reconnecting with her family's Métis heritage, Amber really wants to share this rich and often forgotten history in as many contexts as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amber. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Make sure that looks good. All right. Can everybody see that? Great. Okay. So yeah, thank you, Yi-Chan, for that awesome intro. Just a little bit more info about myself. I'm of Ukrainian, Irish, and Métis heritage, a guest on the beautiful Vancouver Island, Lekwungen territory. My great-grandmother came to the island from St. Malo, Manitoba. She followed sort of the Western sort of push that a lot of Métis people found, sort of went through. So she came from St. Malo, which is sort of southern Manitoba, close to what was the Red River settlement, into Saskatchewan, and then Alberta, and then finally in BC. I was very, very, very fortunate in that I was partially raised by my great-grandmother. She lived till she was about 100 years old. So being able to know her and bond with her as a kid was very, very special. So this presentation is for Métis people in history, but also in honor of my great-grandmother as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. So the southern tip, I'll just preface this by this land acknowledgement is very much catered to where I'm situated, which is the southern tip of Vancouver Island, including Victoria and Langford. The San Juan and Gulf Islands are the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich people. Where I am located here at Bastion Square is just off of what was a mudflat that was abundant with clams and other seafood that nourished the Songhees village in what is now Beacon Hill Park. Bastion Square itself was a Garry Oak ecosystem full of quetlal flowers and roots that were a very important food source to the Songhees. This here is the quetlal, or colonially known as the chemist flower, and this is the Garry Oak tree. So lots of southern Vancouver Island were all beautiful Garry Oak meadows ecosystems. I want to recognize that the land we sit directly on belongs to the Lekwungen people. I want to acknowledge that the land we live and work on was illegitimately taken by our provincial and federal governments, displacing and harming the Coast Salish. I acknowledge we are guests and settlers on this land, and as guests, we have a responsibility to not just name the people whose territories we reside on, but a responsibility to respect and support all conditions of truth, reconciliation, and restitution of these territories to their rightful nations. Land acknowledgement should go beyond a box to be checked or an act of conscious clearing by organizations or individual settlers on this land. They should be disruptive and a call to action. And in that spirit, I call us to visit the website of the Wasanich Leadership Council and look at the resources for settlers, as well as their conditions for the return of their lands. I call you to look into how you can support the Lekwungen Language Reawakening Initiative offered at the Songhees Community Center, if you're local to Victoria or the island. I call all of us to embark on a journey of learning and engaging with the history of these territories, on colonization and its dark and negative impact, and look for ways in your own time to support the Lekwungen and Wasanich people, or get to know the the indigenous nations in your own area and how you can support their efforts for truth, reconciliation, and restitution. All right, so let's get into the beginnings. So this is early 16th to 18th century. The sort of beginning of the fur trade and increased settlement within Eastern Canada from European nations. There is this kind of vision of the European pioneer in Canada, like sort of going solo on the trail and carving out this all by themselves, these like settlements and homesteads and trading routes. And that sort of image that we have is missing a huge portion of that, and sort of the indigenous nations are erased from that sort of image that we have, because the settlers would not have survived if it were not for the indigenous nations, essentially taking them in, showing them how to survive and how to survive on the land. A lot of early records of settlers from indigenous perspectives were like small children or babies, in terms of how well they could survive in this particular climate. So yeah, Europeans could not survive on their own, and they heavily relied on indigenous nations to survive. I really want to emphasize that these beginning relations were much more egalitarian. There is also this kind of vision that, or idea that indigenous people were always acted upon, but there was a mutual interest and a mutual benefit in these early relations. The indigenous people identified a great source of new trading relations, so it was within their interests as well to get these areas, these settlements and trading posts established so that they could have access to European goods as well. So yeah, a lot of the early treaties that were sort of based on these trading relations were developed on equality and fraternity. So as these sort of relations and these routes and trading posts were developing, marriage and unions between Indigenous women and European fur traders became more commonplace. They were predominantly between French Canadian like voyageurs and Nahiawak women, or colonially known as like Cree or Plains Cree. And it gave fur traders valuable contacts within Indigenous communities and tribal communities access to trade goods. So typically the Indigenous women would teach traders how to survive on the land, exchange knowledge in shelter building, food preparation, making clothing suitable to the climate. And they also taught the traders the local language. Daughters typically carried on Indigenous traditions taught by their mothers, and sons became trappers, hunters, or canoemen. A lot of the relations and marriages or unions followed Indigenous traditions, so they weren't sanctioned by the Catholic Church back in Europe, but hey, you're over here. That doesn't really matter so much, but yeah, just kind of like within like European history, these sort of relations weren't really acknowledged. But so towards the end of the 17th century, a very distinctive nation began to develop. Can anyone take a guess? Just shout it out. What you think this nation that developed was? I'll give you a hint. The Métis. So the Métis began to develop towards the end of the 17th. Like I said, a very distinctive culture came to be. So as the nation began to develop and the fur trade expanded, the Métis were critical in establishing trade routes and relations. They were dependent on to establish and navigate trade routes utilizing the Great Lake waterways. This map that we have here is actually cart trails. So these were routes and trails that were carved out by Métis fur traders, specifically for carts. The waterways were more so over here, but obviously like the veins and rivers of the Great Lakes go far and wide all over northwestern Canada. Where the fur trade primarily took place. So, but yeah, this is specifically cart trails, and that's the Red River settlement right there. That would be the largest Métis settlement. But yeah, so they also would negotiate between Europeans and various indigenous groups. Most Métis were polylingual, meaning that they spoke many, many different languages, and French, not so much English. They were expert hunters, trappers, canoemen, and acted as clerks at trading posts. And they sold essential survival goods to those along the routes, including tools, clothing, and pemmican. So you may have, if you went to school here in Canada, you may have learned about pemmican. It's basically the ultimate trail food. It includes typically shredded bison, some sort of animal lard, and berries. So you kind of have all of the components to sort of keep you going on the trail. All right, so as they developed as a nation, so did their settlements and culture. Métis established many settlements along fur trading routes, but the largest was the Red River in Manitoba, as we spoke about in the last slide. They could be identified by a kind of uniform, a blue coat, beaded pipe bag, and the iconic red sash. The Métis developed their own flag as well, which was first flown at the Battle of Seven Oaks. Yeah, so this sort of swath of blue land here is considered like the traditional Métis territory, and the Red River settlement is just a little sort of blip in here. And when we talk about traditional territory, we're not talking about ownership of land or like bordered land that was the Métis. Essentially, this swath of land is where they lived, worked, and subsisted. Yeah, so as we talked about, the Métis flag, which is my background here, was first flown at the Battle of Seven Oaks. So the flag has a lot of symbolism and pride behind it. It represents the mixing and flow of two cultures in the subsequent creation of a new nation. The infinity also represents how our nation will live forever, no matter the hardships or the attempts to suppress us. So Métis, the people who own themselves. So yeah, throughout this early history, the Métis established a reputation of being incredibly versatile and adaptable to whatever the fur trade and Turtle Island had in store. We were known for our endurance, strength, intellect, and most important of all, our good humor. There's lots of records saying that, you know, on the trails, the Métis people were often, even during that extremely grueling work of like portaging, which is where you sort of take the boat or canoe that you were using to navigate those waterways where it was unnavigatable through water. You would haul that boat out, take all of the trade goods that were on it, usually hundreds, if not thousands of pounds, strap it to your back, take the boat out, flip it over, carry it, and then carry it through these very like treacherous trails. So even through that incredibly difficult work, there was always song, jokes. Again, there's just a jovial spirit overall. So yeah, Europeans regarded us for our independence and passion, as did the Nahiowak, giving us the name Oti Peumsoak, the people who own themselves. So I have a couple of videos, some videos here to share with you, just some short little clips on some Métis inventions that came out through the fur trade, through the very specialized needs of Canada and the particular environment that we live in. The Métis lifestyle was never to be described as quiet or sedate. We are and were a people who thought, fought, worked, and played hard. And this passion and tenacity is exemplified, especially through our innovations in art. So we'll start with the York boat here. I have to apologize. The presentation software I'm using to get to full, it likes to kick you out when leaving full screens, and then I have to go back into the presentation. So sorry about that, but can we hear the video? Good.
Yes.
The York boat is an important part of Canadian history with a special connection to the Métis people. The boats were named after the Hudson's Bay Company's York factory and became their main mode of freight transportation. They were built with local wood and iron forged by local blacksmiths. The first York boats were crafted in the 1740s and used by Métis and voyageurs during the fur trade because of their ability to carry 2 to 3 times more cargo than the birch bark canoe. York boats were used to travel on the lakes and rivers from the Hudson's Bay Company York Post to reach inland trading posts. It was stronger and safer than other boats and able to withstand ice and storms. In the 1880s, the York boats were slowly replaced by the steamship on the larger lakes and rivers, and the last used boat was constructed in 1920. The York boat played an important role in expanding the trade industry within Manitoba.
Okay, just being mindful of time here, I'm just going to skip over the video for the Red River carts, but essentially they were special carts designed specifically for the environment and climate that they were dealing with here. So the wheels were extra large to be able to navigate through like mud flat, marsh, water without getting your goods wet. They also could be turned into like sleighs for snow. The wheels would come off. They were made from local wood. So if something broke, you could just pop into the forest, get some wood and repair it easily. They would also attach like animal hides around the cart and make it a raft to go over sort of deeper areas of water. So they were extremely, extremely versatile. And then we have the Métis sash. So before I mentioned the iconic red sash. So the solid sash was actually originally, the solid red sash was originally worn by voyageurs, French Canadian voyageurs, but it became known a very prominent symbol of Métis identity, and the Métis sort of adorned them with this fishboning pattern, and each color sort of represents something else, and they were crafted using indigenous finger weaving techniques and European wool. So the color red represents the blood of the Métis that was shed through the years while fighting for our rights. Blue is for the depths of our spirits. Green is for the fertility of a great nation. White is for our connection to the earth and our creator. Yellow is for prosperity and honor. And later on, small strands of black representing colonization, the loss of our language, cultural disconnect, and residential schools. And they were very versatile. So they would be used in many different ways. Like they were a first aid kit. They could be used as a sling. The frayed ends here really worked well as like emergency sewing kits. They would be parts of the fabric would be taken off and used as thread to repair clothing. They were back braces. They would be slung around the sort of end part of the York boats to help haul the boats up onto the land, and lots of other uses. So they were very practical as well as decorative. And beadwork. Métis beadwork is we were known as the flower beadwork people. So these beautiful floral designs are sort of the heart of Métis beadwork. And I just have another little video for you so the artisans can kind of speak for themselves.
Every culture is identified by its art. What it is that makes it unique, what identifies the artwork as Métis, that's really important.
Métis art is important to Métis people because it expresses some of the traditional art forms, capote making, sash making, beading and weaving. They come from both European and Aboriginal art forms, but together they mesh into something new. I think that's what the Métis are proud of.
Métis beadwork, the style came from the Grey Nuns teaching the Métis their folk art, their European folk art.
They started getting the French embroidery patterns, seeing what they saw in nature, even telling stories in their beadwork. And so they came up with their own style of beadwork. We were called the flower beadwork people.
Everything from the earth, so flowers, tendrils, leaves, berries, sometimes roots, all of that's in there.
A lot of people don't really see the absolute craftsmanship of the Métis beadwork that these women were doing in the conditions that they were living in. They were hauling wood, they were cooking, cleaning, and yet they took the time to make these pieces of beadwork that were absolutely beautiful.
The beads are so small that I've often wondered, how can you do something so intricate by coal oil lamp, by candlelight, or just by daylight, and probably without reading glasses?
One of the teachings with beading is teaching patience, and it doesn't happen fast. There's no instant gratification in beading. There's life and there's a breath in the work that you're doing, and you have to slow down, and your heart rate slows down, and your breathing deepens, and there's just this connection that happens. I love the sound of the thread being pulled up through the fabric, up through the hide. There's just something so alive about it.
Okay. All right. So moving on, the fiddle and jig. So the Métis were especially known for our love of the fiddle and dancing. Once fiddles began to be imported, the Métis immediately took to them, combining Indigenous Scottish and French rhythms. Imported fiddles were extremely expensive, so the Métis made their own by using local wood. And despite a lack of formal training in crafting, many Métis people became master crafters and expert players of the fiddle. Yeah, there are a lot of different Métis folk tunes, but the Red River Jig is the most popular, and it's kind of like the theme song of the of Métis Nation. If ever you're watching a video about Métis people, you hear like a sort of jolly, jovial kind of jig in the background, it's probably the Red River Jig. And yeah, so also dancing was a huge part. The vitality and endurance of the work that they were doing really came out when it came to jigging as well. Jigging competitions were held frequently, and they would last for hours from dusk until dawn, dancing pretty much that entire time. Again, the jig is a blend of European, mainly Scottish, and Indigenous step dancing. And the Red River Jig is the most common, both in music and in terms of steps. So during the song, there is like a high part where you would do a traditional step, and then it dips down into a low part where you would do a fancy step or even improvise, and it sort of just kind of repeats like that. So I have this video of this group that I really love. I have to apologize for the Canadian Canada's Got Talent of it all. It's just like one of the only videos of this group that was like super clear and exemplified a kind of modern twist on the dance as well. We're talking about history here, so I'm referring to a lot of things in the past, but I like how this video exemplifies that this is, Métis culture is still living, breathing modern culture. So yeah, that's the Ivan Flett Memorial Dancers. Okay, and finally, language. So the Métis developed their own language called Michif. It's a combination of Nahiawak verbs and French nouns. It's also called Southern Michif, Heritage Michif, Michif Cree, and On An Cree in Michif. It exists in a number of dialects as well. And I just want to note that, as you can see, a lot of cultural, like the cultural blending of Métis is Nahiawak, which is a nation that kind of extends from the like Midwestern prairie area into like up into Manitoba and into the Saskatchewan prairie. So that large swath and beyond as well. So yeah, so the legend himself, Louis Riel. So I do have another video here for us. I do apologize for its length. If I were to try and cover the history of Louis Riel myself, it would probably be another hour in this presentation. So this this video is a very succinct kind of overview of Louis Riel and the history surrounding him. So yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I actually share a grandfather with Louis Riel. So again, there's a, I would go on and on about it. Most Métis people will claim relation to Louis Riel, so who knows if that's actually true, but that's what my family says anyways. But yes,
Before we
here's
get into
Louis.
the history of Louis Riel and the creation of Manitoba, let's start with some backstory on Riel. He was born October 22nd, 1844, and was the oldest of 11 children. He grew up in the settlement known as Red River, the precursor to what is now known as Winnipeg. Riel found himself taking after his father to study to become a priest in Montreal. After his father's death, Riel dropped out of college but stuck around Montreal. Now that you know a little bit about Riel, let's get into the formation of Manitoba, also known as the Red River Rebellion. Louis Riel came back to the Red River settlement just in time to stop a land survey led by one William McDougall. A Métis National Council was formed by John Bruce to gather the voices and concerns of the Métis. Discussion began between Canada and the National Council. The Métis were worried they would be pushed off their land, so Riel led an uprising and seized control of Upper Fort Garry. With this, the Hudson's Bay Governor McTavish ordered the Métis to lay down their arms, so Riel proposed a provisional government. Ownership of Rupert's Land transferred from the Hudson's Bay Company to Canada. The provisional government is formed with John Bruce as its president, later replaced by Louis Riel himself after Bruce fell ill. Negotiations began between Canada and the Métis provisional government. The Métis came up with a list of rights to negotiate a formal annexation. While this was happening, Riel's guardsmen arrested 48 armed men calling themselves Canadians. Thomas Scott was among those 48 arrested. He was described as crude and attempted to escape multiple times. Thomas Scott was executed by the provisional government. After some back and forth between the Métis and Canada, the Manitoba Act is passed and receives royal assent. Manitoba is now a province. Shortly after the act is passed, the Wolseley expedition comes to confront Riel for executing Thomas Scott. Louis Riel flees south and settles across the border. Riel didn't stay in the States for long, this time, and quietly returned home. There was an attempted raid by the Fenian from the US border, and Riel gathered a Métis cavalry to prove his commitment to keep peace with Canada. There were mixed feelings surrounding Riel in Ontario. He was widely known as a murderer, and a $5,000 bounty was put on his head. But in Quebec and Manitoba, he was a hero defending the Métis, French culture, and the Catholic faith. Because of this, Riel was elected into the House of Commons on 3 different occasions. The federal government approved a motion that Louis Riel was to be banished from Her Majesty's dominions for 5 years. He found himself in Montana and reintegrated himself with the Métis down south. While in exile, he became an American citizen and married Marguerite Monet de Bellemare. They had 3 children together. Now we're going to dive into the Northwest Resistance and the Battle of Batoche. Many indigenous groups were suffering due to low bison population. Their land was being signed away through treaties, and towns, farmland, and railroads were pushing them out. The Métis were experiencing low crop harvests, and the fur trade was slowing to a crawl. A man named Gabriel Dumas was especially dissatisfied with Canada's lack of action and reached out to Louis Riel in hopes of him aiding them with his past experience negotiating with Canada. Riel agreed under the terms of bringing his family in with Batoche, as well as being able to return to Montana once negotiations were complete. History repeats itself and the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan is formed with Louis Riel as president, and they try to negotiate with Canada. They were ignored, and the Métis organized the 300-man battalion and moved to seize the Hudson's Bay post in Fort Carleton. The Métis' first battle in the Northwest Resistance is known as the Battle of Duck Lake. A large group of Métis and First Nations faced the force of the Northwest Mounted Police. The Métis and First Nations won and returned to Batoche. With the loss at Duck Lake, the Canadian government formed a militia to deal with Louis Riel and the Métis once and for all. The plan was simple: march all the Canadian troops to Batoche. Louis Riel caught word of the Canadians' plans and sought to focus all of his men in defending Batoche. Gabriel Dumas had a different idea: cut them off with a surprise attack. Dumas won the argument, and the Métis force moved to confront the Canadians. This fight is known as the Battle of Fish Creek. The Canadians tried to fight off the Métis resistors, but suffered heavy casualties and retreated. Now begins the Battle of Batoche, and spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for the Métis. On May 9th, the Canadian General Frederick Middleton commanded his forces to attack the southern end of Batoche. Day after day, Middleton would attack and retreat, attack and retreat. On May 12th, the Métis were overrun, largely due to being short on ammunition. Louis Riel surrendered on May 15th. Riel was formally charged with treason, and his trial began in Regina. Riel's lawyer was trying to excuse Riel on the grounds of insanity due to a time he spent in asylum in 1876. Riel didn't want to be excused because of insanity, as he believed it would discredit the Métis and their mistreatment by the Canadian government. After undergoing a psych evaluation, Riel was deemed sane and was later charged guilty, and the jury recommended clemency, but it was overruled in favor of execution. So that's it, isn't it? Riel's wife Marguerite moved to live with Riel's family and later died of tuberculosis. Their 3 children all passed before being able to have kids of their own. His legacy is over. But remember, Riel was the eldest of 11 siblings who were able to have children of their own. Marguerite also had siblings who had their kids. That's not to say his legacy only lives through his family. Every Métis person carries his legacy. We look upon him with gratitude, and he helped solidify the Métis as people, not just half-breeds. He saved lives and defended the ones that didn't have a voice, and that's why he's a hero.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, that video gives like a really great overall sort of general timeline. There's a few sort of points in history I just kind of want to expand on a little bit. So the Red River Resistance, the battle sort of in the very first part of the video, which led to the Provisional Government and the Manitoba Act, was sparked by the transfer of Rupert's Land. And why that was an issue is because Rupert's Land, if we think back to that map with the blue swath of land of the traditional Métis territory, that's basically Rupert's Land, or at least like 80% of that is Rupert's Land. And the Métis were not consulted during this transfer of land. So there was a lot of anxiety over what was going to happen. And the settlements in those areas had been lived in for generations, and them not being consulted meant that they were sort of at the mercy of whatever the Canadian government decided to do with that land, which they ultimately said, no, we should be consulted, and we should have a say and be able to establish our own like our rights in the eyes of the Canadian government to this land. So that's how the Provisional Government in Manitoba Act came around. The Manitoba Act was sort of the answer to that question of legitimizing within the eyes of the government's Métis land claims. So what came out of the Manitoba Act were scripts. So scripts was a system introduced to facilitate the Métis getting official titles to their land, but it was a massive failure. It wasn't just the Métis that were given scripts. Basically, scripts were used to legitimize homesteads from European settlers as well, other kind of land claims. But the script system that came specifically out of the Manitoba Act was meant for the Métis, and they were supposed to rein in the other scripts that were being issued until the land issue with the Métis was resolved. The issue with these scripts is that there was a lot of issues with them. It was not done in good faith, essentially. Same with the sort of treaty system. The understanding from the Métis is that it was giving rights to their lands they were already subsisting on. And then what the government did is they marched in government officials from the Land Dominions Act. They would bring tents in to Métis communities, bring them into the tents to issue these scripts, which were mostly in English, which most Métis didn't speak. And they were also giving them parcels of land nowhere near where they were settled. So the government's idea of giving land is just like a random amount of acreage where they decide it goes. Usually, a lot of it was in southern Manitoba or southern areas. So the Métis that was living further north. It just didn't make sense. Accepting the script would have meant that they are fracturing their community. They're moving away from the territory that they were are subsisting off and had farmland on. So it would mean starting brand new without your community. So, and at this time, the Métis were living, a lot of them were very impoverished because of the decline of the fur trade and the destruction of the bison herds. So what they ended up doing is selling these scripts to land speculators that would hang out outside of these tents where the scripts were being issued. So they ended up I think it ended up being only 1% of the land that was promised actually ended up in Métis hands. Because again, the land that was offered was not within where they were living and subsisting for generations. So it made more sense for them to have get the money for them so that they can cover their basic necessities for a little while. These were not meant to be transferable. What the land speculators would do was essentially forge a signature or created a bunch of forgeries under Métis names, and then and that was the other issue, is that if you were to finalize these scripts, that you would have to go all the way to Ottawa or the Land Dominions Act office in Ontario. If you have limited resources and you're all the way over in Saskatchewan, that's not really viable either. So yeah, the script system, it's not something that's commonly learned in history. I definitely recommend, if you want to look deeper into to any of this, definitely look into the Métis script system. So the failure of the script system is what led to the increased anxiety over the loss of land, culture, community, and that's sort of what led to the Battle of Batoche, that last and final stand, and it's what led to Louis Riel returning from the States. Yeah, so in conclusion, I'm going to play a little bit of the Red River Jig here, not too loud. But yeah, I just want to say that everything we learned today are just little sort of tidbits of Métis history. It's really supposed to kind of give you sort of jumping off points if you're interested in researching or finding out more about Métis history. And, Louis Riel certainly wasn't without his faults, but he was a very important political leader for the Métis and anyone with a spirit of resistance to the unjust. He fought fiercely for Métis rights and sovereignty, and his spirit of resistance independence continues to live large in the hearts and minds of the Métis as we continue to fight for our land sovereignty and recognition. And I hope throughout this presentation I've highlighted how important Métis land and independence was hard fought, hard won, and at times hard lost. If you remember nothing else from today, remember the legacy and lifeblood of the Métis is a spirit of passion, independence, and joy. We are not just fighters, but artists, innovators, and craftsmen with a very deep love for community and joy. We are the people who own themselves, a people forever. So yeah, that's the main historical part of my presentation. But I thought it might be fun for us to learn some Red River jig steps. So when I've done this in person, we've actually got up and danced, but you can do the steps while sitting in your chair. So this is a Métis dance group from Surrey. And they're going to teach us the basic step and a fancy step. Not the fanciest of steps, but a fancy step nonetheless.
Today La Valley here.
Surrey Fusion Festival.
So yeah, no, you don't have to if you're not, whatever you feel bodily able to, just, you know, or whatever space you have to learn.
Ado, here's Rowan and Quinn Picker.
So we're going to be teaching you the basic step first. We'll start with the basic step and move into the fancy step. There are two sections of the dance, and it starts off with 3 simple steps. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So when you get the hop down, we move into the next step of the basic step, and it's a kick. So it's 1, 2, 3, kick. 1, 2, 3, kick. 1, 2, 3, kick. 1, 2, 3, kick. And that's our basic step. That's basically our basic step. So you can follow along. And then when the music changes to the second part, the fancy step, we're going to do something called the side to side. So we start with our left foot.
Yep.
And we go side to side, side to side. So we'll start off slow with JJ playing the Red River Jig, and try and follow along if you want. And yeah, and then we'll speed up as we go and see if you can keep up.
Don't be afraid to get up and just give her.
Just give her. All right, start slow.
A little bit slow, right?
Yeah.
Just doing that in your chair is hard, and that's the basic steps. So imagine doing that for hours, just hours on end, and then the dancers here going to what they call Métis speed. So just to give you like a little idea of how how like insane these jigging competitions for hours would be. It would be like this level of dancing for hours. So yeah, just a little taste. But yeah, did anyone have any, well, we have the last sort of 10 minutes here. Did anyone have any questions or things they want to know more about?
Yeah, please, everybody, welcome to put your questions in the chat. Amber, I feel like I need like 1/100th speed of that.
I know the speed that they're
Whoa.
teaching at is
That is
like
amazing.
it's crazy. Yeah.
Mhm. Right. Well, I had a question that came up that
Yeah.
I'm curious about, because I think a lot of uh, uh, groups of people, when they start to blend, that there's some question about, kind of like who counts. And so I'm curious if Métis Nation ever had a, like only if your mother is, or only if you have more than 50%, or, is there
Yeah.
any kind of, traditions that govern that?
There definitely are. So essentially, like, it's kind of hard to describe, but sometimes people think that like a marriage between like an Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous person makes a Métis person, even like in modern day now. But that's why we kind of speak to that distinctive cultural group that came out of specifically the like 17th, 18th century. That is the Métis. And a lot of there for a while there was this idea that the Métis, you had to track your genealogy specifically to the Red River settlement. But as we saw with that map, like the Métis existed across all of Canada and into the United States. In the US, Métis people aren't recognized as a nation. So yeah, it does kind of get a little bit confusing in terms of like what qualifies as a Métis person, but typically you just have to like be able to point to somebody who is considered like Métis during like the within like the very specific cultural context of it.
Yeah. No, it's just always interesting. I know that, like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, traditionally Jewish lineage is passed down through the mother, right? And so
Oh, yeah.
if your mother is Jewish, then you are Jewish.
Yeah.
And then, like, I think about in the US, how there's like the one drop rule,
Yeah.
for, if you're one drop black, then you're black, right? So
Yeah.
so there's I mean, obviously not today, but there's a lot of those kind of historical traditions that
Yeah.
people have used to kind of protect themselves, or separate themselves, or separate
Yeah.
each other, right? And so there's some interesting tension there. Yeah.
Yeah. I would definitely say that those kind of roles are definitely very like specifically in like the colonial government context of it.
Mhm.
Indigenous people have their own ways of identifying who's a part of that group or tribe, and like specific like genealogy, like one drop rule kind of came from the colonial government.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of Indigenous Canadian people who, in the eyes of the government, is not actually considered status Indigenous. So the whole status system too is really fraught with issues, and it's extremely problematic because a lot of people who are Indigenous aren't considered status. So there is a disconnect between what the Canadian government considers or did consider and still kind of considers Indigenous, and how Indigenous people self-identify, and it's the same thing with Métis as well.
Yep, colonialism in so many
Yeah,
parts.
I
Yeah,
mean,
for sure.
it's a tactic to be able to say that there's less Indigenous people than there actually are in on Turtle Island and in Canada,
Yes.
colonial
Great
Canada.
point. Great point. And do you have a sense of how many people are part of Métis Nation today?
I don't actually. That's a great question. I know like almost I like constantly run into Métis people though. There is like the Métis Federation in BC. And yeah, it's a very it's a very like kind of fractured and displaced nation, the Métis, but we're putting in efforts to um, you know, uh, uh, become like a solid solid nation, even if you don't all live together community. But yeah, they're, I'll be talking to someone and it turns out they're Métis all the time. I actually met somebody who was like a direct like her last name was Riel, so that was pretty cool.
Wow.
Like I said, most Métis people will claim heritage or like descendant from like Louis Riel family tree. So
well, with 11 brothers and sisters.
yeah,
It's quite prolific
very
family.
true.
Right. Yeah, I guess other questions that I have in terms of, I just think that's fascinating. The that they created violins and fiddles, like on their own.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of like, have they adopted or adapted the violin for other kinds of purposes that are more suited to them or to the wood that's available to them?
Yes, so that was it's the same with the York boat and the Red River cart. They were very explicitly made from local woods.
Right.
So it was taking knowledge of like what are the hardiest woods, what are the most pliable woods, especially for York boats with the curvature of it. York boats kind of you can kind of see it's both a fusion of like a canoe and like a Viking ship. They're a little bit larger and like shallower because you can distribute trade goods like the weight better. They could carry hundreds and thousands of pounds of trade goods. So yeah, until the steamships came in, that's what was driving the fur trade economy was those innovations and the Red River cart too. So yeah, I think the fiddle in particularly is quite a feat because there is a delicacy to the craftsmanship of that isn't the Red River carts, although York boats did take quite a high level of craftsmanship as well. I do feel like an instrument there is like very specific, so to be able to take like see an instrument and be like I can make that and then adapt it to the Canadian, to what was available to them is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it is such an art. And so I only know of the very like Western tradition of them being made in like, for example, Cremona,
Yeah.
and having like having to know that history very well. I had no idea. I was like, can I buy a fiddle?
There's artisans. Yeah, there's
is that
artisans out
something
there
that's
for sure.
continued on and
Oh yeah.
that's
There's
amazing.
actually there's a video of a York boat it didn't give so much the history, but it was this Métis craftsman who was like, well, I've never seen a York boat. Why don't I make one? So he's based out of Surrey and he fully just made like a full York boat. And I think it's on display. I can't remember at what museum in particular, but yeah, there's still lots of Métis craftsmen who are like reclaiming that craftsmanship and making instruments and like you saw with the beading and yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I do want to just thank you so much for today's presentation, and I know you had an opportunity to present to the students in person a few months ago, and so. So that must have been fun for everybody to be doing the jig together.
Yes, it was. It was. I got a few brave souls to get up there with me. And when you're actually like standing up and doing it, like the physical effort is like insane. We were all sweating and out of breath.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and everybody, please enjoy the long weekend. And on Monday, on Louis Riel Day, think about his legacy, and probably that we have a lot more Métis among us than we know. And
yes,
so that's always nice to learn more about the people and the culture. So
yeah, like I said, it's just support to be an overall introduction to the history. So if anything sparked your interest, I definitely recommend giving a deeper dive.
Yeah, great. Miigwech, and have a good one. Take
yes,
care.
thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks everybody.